I think one of the first things to do when you're looking at a crane system is to get a good overhead crane guy involved in the system. We know what questions to ask, and we have looked at very many different applications. This is the overhead crane information questionnaire put out by the Crane Manufacturers Association. And Justin went through this form and highlighted what we feel is the important information.
I'm just going to jump in real fast and say that everyone here today will get an email, a follow-up email with all these documents for you to have for yourself. So we're not going to go line by line through, like on this page, you have the crane inquiry data sheet. We're not going to go line by line through that today. We'll follow up with that in an email so everybody has that in a PDF.
Okay. This is the crane manufacturer's specification on and classification of cranes. And basically what we're going to talk about is the Class C and the Class D cranes. Class C cranes are pretty much light duty cranes used in machine shops, paper mills, like plastic injection molding facilities. If you can find out from your customer what their application is, like what do? Do they make structural steel or plastic injections? So that's a Class C crane, average 50% of the rated capacity with 5 to 10 lifts per hour, averaging 15 feet, not over 50% of the lifted rated capacity. That's a Class C crane. Class D crane is a heavier duty crane. It's basically designed for twice as much work as the Class C crane with 10 to 20 lifts an hour. Same thing, 65% of the rated capacity. Can we look at the next one, Justin?
Sure, that's just good information for you to get from your customer as far as the capacity of the cranes and what for the crane company to know. For you to know for your metal building contractor is going to be more of this information up here on the crane inquiry data sheet, which is going to have some information like the hook height of the crane, how many cranes they're looking for, the wheel spacing on the cranes. So this is the key information for general contractors need to prepare a bid, and Wally's going to go ahead and take that one.
Right. So we use the Chief Building Inquiry crane information data sheet. And basically everything that you're asking for on the data sheet is in a crane drawing. So right up front, you want to go to your crane supplier and get a crane drawing if the end user doesn't already have that for you. So also you can look to the metal building manufacturer rep for that help too.
Yeah, I think it's real important to, when a customer comes and you're pricing out a building where there's going to be an overhead crane, to reach out right away to your pre-engineered metal building supplier and your crane supplier, start getting some good communication going between everybody. This crane drawing, I don't think there's an expectation as a builder that you're going to be able to fill out every blank on the Chief's building form or Barker Prudent or Butler or whoever your building supplier is. You're not going to have the information to fill all of that out. All the information is on the crane drawing, but what I suggest you do is send your crane information data sheet to your crane supplier. I fill out these sheets for my builders all the time, or we'll fill it out together. But I think it's really important to get everybody involved at that point in time. The sooner you get your crane supplier involved, I think the better off you are.
These crane drawings, if you call us up and tell us that you need a crane drawing on a 10-ton, 60-foot span crane, both Mark and Justin crank those out in about 5 minutes. So it's really no big deal.
Yeah, there's no proprietary data on these crane sheets. And if you ask for a 5-ton crane drawing at 70-foot span, and then you go back to your customer and the span changes, comes down to 60 feet, that's a 3 to 5 minute change that can be done right away.
Hey, Justin, Larry Heckman here again. Can you talk to us real briefly, though, about when you have multiple cranes in an aisle and those having to potentially be operating in the same bay at the same time? Is that information that can or should be communicated on that crane data sheet just kind of walk us through that, because oftentimes I feel like that information has to be always followed up and requested.
Yes, that is information that is on the crane data sheet. There is on your data sheet, it shows the wheels of the cranes and gives dimensions to fill in as far as the wheel spacing per crane, and then the space from one crane wheel to the next crane wheel. So if your customer comes and they want 3 5-ton cranes on one runway, you need to ask them, are they ever going to be using two of the cranes together or all three of the cranes at the same time? Do they want their runway capacity to be 5-ton, 10-ton, or 15-ton? That's information that you're going to need to have from your customer that they need to supply to you so you can properly fill out this crane data form. It's very often where the cranes, you have 2 10-ton cranes on a runway and it's 25-foot building column spacing. And if you have 2 10-ton cranes, there's no limits between the cranes. And so the runway needs to be designed for 20-ton. Does that kind of answer the question you were looking for, Larry?
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, that crane information sheet that Chief still can use, but it's rarely, filled out anymore. Everything's been, converted over to an electronic format within our pricing system. But those benchmarks, those details obviously are all now been electrified, if you will, for lack of a better way to explain, where we're effectively just having to go ahead and type in all that information versus the old days. Yeah, we used to do a lot of, handwritten, filling out those forms. But I guess, what I don't seem to ever see jumping off the paper is that, like, that R&M sheet you have there on your screen. And it's got all the information that you have, but oftentimes when you see multiple cranes in an aisle, and you might even have different crane capacities in that aisle. You could have a 10-ton, a 20-ton, or a 15-ton. You could have 3 bridges running up and down there, but I do not see that noted either on the architectural structural drawings that we're bidding off of, and or that not data sheet, but that schematic, that R&M schematic. I don't ever see that typically clarified. Am I wrong in that assessment?
No, I don't think you're wrong in that assessment. I think that's a clarification that the general contractor needs to make with the owner. Or if they have the crane supplier involved, that's a clarification that we will make. That would be one of the first questions I would ask a customer is, you're looking to buy in this one bay, you have a 5-ton crane and a 10-ton crane. What do you want the total capacity of the runway to be? Are you going to bring those 2 cranes together to pick up 15 tons and clarify that? I do believe your sheet does kind of clarify crane aisles and the cranes in each aisle, the capacity of the cranes in each aisle. And I believe the other metal building forms do kind of have a bit of a clarification. On the bottom of your crane information form, it says crane 1 and the aisle numbers and the capacities. And then they're also up above, it has a dimension F saying that's the distance the wheels will stay apart. But yeah, I think that having the metal building, like you, for example, as the rep involved with a crane rep involved also, to clarify that is very important, because you're right, it's not always right on architectural drawings.
I'd like to interject here. It's very simple for a crane manufacturer to keep the cranes out of each bay. So electronically, we just put electronic eyes on the cranes, and we can set how close those cranes can get to each other.
Understood. Now, in a perfect world, that sheet to the right would come to me in the RFP process, just spoon fed. But we all know, that's never going to happen, most likely. So yeah, I guess the point that I'm making is, if the R&M sheet would actually have that clarified, great. Or even on the drawings, if the architect wants to take the time to mandate that and do a call out, even better. But I think for the general contractors that are on this phone, on this Teams meeting today, don't be surprised when you get that question. And maybe everybody just kind of has an understanding it's part of the RFI process when you're putting scope of work together. But that's always going to be one of my hot button issues for sure.
The next slide here is understanding supplier responsibilities. So we'll start with the crane rail. It's my belief that the crane supplier should be supplying the crane rail. And that's the way it's done 95% of the time. It's been a long time since I've had a pre-engineered metal building supplier want to supply crane rail. Remember in the past, years ago, Butler used to always want to supply the crane rail. The reason for that is then the supplier, the crane supplier, he's responsible for that crane rail and making sure that it's straightened to tolerance. And then when we go in to set the crane rail and we pull lines, then we're able to check the tolerances of the runway beams. And that's what this table 6.1 is. This will also be included in this PDF that I sent you. This is from the Metal Building Manufacturers Association. These are the tolerances that your erector has to erect runway beams to. And when we check these tolerances when we're pulling our lines for our crane rail and make sure that they're within tolerance. And these tolerances have to be kept so our crane rail can be within its tolerances. So crane rail, I believe, should be by the crane supplier. The runway electrification, obviously, I think is by the crane supplier. But that also brings up something that we run into not very often, but the crane has 4-bar electrification up at the runway, but it's the responsibility of the general contractor and the electrician to run conduit to a disconnect and then run from that disconnect conduit up to those 4 bars of electrification. And I've been doing this for 22 years and Wally for a lot longer than that. Crane Tech as a crane company, we have never once run conduit and installed a disconnect and run conduit from the disconnect up to the crane. So it's pretty clear for us that that's a responsibility and just something to look out for, to make sure when you're bidding the process and you're talking to your electrician, they know that that's their responsibility. The next thing on the list is the runway beams. It's my belief that the runway beams should come from the metal building company. Buy it all from one person. It's not all that uncommon that I'm asked to price runway beams, and I'm happy to supply pricing. But if you're buying a building and they're designing haunches or independent columns to hold up these runway beams, and then you're going to erect the building yourself, I think it's best practice to buy those runway beams through your pre-engineered metal building supplier. The next thing is end stops. End stops should come from whoever supplies the runway beams. Now, that doesn't always happen. And I think coordination is where you can prevent that from happening. As a crane supplier, I will always ask that question, but I don't know if that question always does get asked on every project from other companies. And I'll always make sure that your metal building supplier is supplying the end stops. They would get missed. And so about 5 years ago, I started putting just a little bit of money in every project. And I always send a set of end stops with a crane. They don't always get used, but I always have end stops so I can put them up there and we can just move on with the project and not worry about why they got, who missed them and why they got missed. I cover them on my end, but I always ask also ahead of time. So end stops, again, it's just coordination, talking with your subs and letting that, asking the pre-engineered building supplier, listening, talking with the crane supplier. And then installation, I have when. I get asked a lot about leaving a section of the roof off to install a crane. And it's the crane supplier's responsibility to ask if he wants to have a section of the roof left off. I have not had a section of the roof left off on a crane project in probably 6 years, and that's hundreds of cranes. We do not need a section of the roof left off, and if we do, we'll ask for it. I like to install all of my cranes in the last 80%, last 20% of the project at the very end when we're working on finished floor. That's our preference. That's what we found works best for installing overhead cranes.
Hey, Justin.
Yes.
We got a question here from Tom Carney from Barco Pruden. He asked, does the crane supplier usually provide the underhung crane beams and suspension?
That's a good question.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is.
That's on a case by case basis. I believe that if they're hanging from Barker Bruton's building or Chief's building, the best person to supply those is the pre-engineered metal building supplier. But that's for sure an instance where you need to have communication between your pre-engineered metal building supplier and your crane supplier working closely together to help design that system. But I hope that answers that question. We do on occasion, I'm working on a project now where I'm supplying the runway beams, the underhung runway beams. And my engineer worked with the building designers to help design the building, giving them all the loading that they needed. But again, in my opinion, I think it's a case by case scenario, but the majority of the time that should come from the pre-engineered metal building supplier.
With that said, we can supply that too. It's underhung cranes are not that common.
We got one other question here from Joe Allen. How do manufacturers typically rectify or allow adjustment for the 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch tolerance required for crane beam span and straightness versus a tall pre-engineered metal building with an L over 500 tolerance, which could be closer to 2 inch? I'm gonna let you talk that through, Justin, before I touch it. Do you have anything to add?
No, the only thing I would add is this table 6.1 is from the Metal Building Manufacturers Association of America. And that's their spec for crane runway beam tolerances. And as a crane supplier, I have tolerances that I have to meet as far as that 1/4 inch over 20 for span.
Well, metal building manufacturers, the way to adjust that is that those holes where the runway beam meets the building are typically slotted, so they can adjust it in and out, up and down. It needs to be adjusted at the bottom of the column.
We'll go ahead and
Yeah,
let you answer. I'm gonna take that from there, Larry.
From my perspective, I would say obviously deflection is super ultra critical, especially when you get into the heavier crane systems out there. Precision is obviously key. There's not a lot of room for there is a lot of room for tolerance, I suppose. You have to be locked in. The deflections are going to drive how we design. So our engineers are going to simply have to look at all things that are going on in the building, environmental loads, coupled with, what the actual deflection criteria from the CMAA is. That's all on the table. I guess I'm not sure, Joe, you can unmute yourself and add to your question, but certainly if we see something during the design side, in the beginning stages of the design of the building system, we are absolutely going to have all hands on deck and everybody's got to be in the know there. And that might be a conversation with the crane company as well.
Yeah, so it's a real world project, and for the sake of the agreement we usually have in the MBCA, I don't want to name manufacturers or anything like that, but we have a building that's roughly 80 feet tall that has 2 separate cranes that are long span over 100 feet. So we get 3/8 tolerance on those according to the charts. And the plumb tolerance for the exterior columns is about 1 3/4 inch, 13/16, something like that. But the beams do not have slotted holes on the stubs or the tiebacks that go to it. And yet we're expected to get that crane rail to within 3/8 when we have 4 times that play in the outer columns in the rigid direction. So because it's the rigid direction of the pre-engineered building frame, there's not a lot of adjustment that you can do easily on a 80-90 foot tall building, besides a crap ton of shimming and things like that to get the straightness and then the span, right? Because they're on 2 separate frame lines, each crane. And this particular building has parallel cranes, 2 separate over 100 foot long parallel cranes. And if the building's allowed to be out 1 13/16, you would expect that they would slot the holes. So the subs that are working on straightening that crane rail, are I think rightfully a little bit concerned that that adjustment was not built into the manufacturer's supply of the crane rails. And the manufacturer always want to say, well, a little bit of reaming, but we're talking about potentially up to an inch or more of reaming on every crane rail. Not that that's the case, but potentially it could be when the building is erected to tolerance, but you can't get the beams straight. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. It makes a lot of sense. So,
Yeah, I don't know if there's a silver bullet answer to that, but I would say I've seen some ugliness out there where tolerances can't be achieved. And I had one job in particular where, the beams had to be effectively remanufactured because of what you're describing. And the crane techs of the world obviously aren't going to warranty the crane system if it's basically running up and down that aisle like on a roller coaster track.
So I suppose the end question would be, it's an extraordinarily tight tolerance, and I understand it for your rails. For the beams themselves, that's intended to keep the rail centered over the web of the beam, obviously. But have you seen exceptions, or who would provide the exception if you could get it to within a half an inch instead of 3/8 or something from the center of the web, because there's just no adjustment left in the building? Or has that ever happened, or is it just always held to the MBMA spec?
if it happens, and when that happens, we go back to the structural engineer who designed the runway beams, and ask them.
Yeah,
Ask
there's
them
a
if that
rule of
beam
thumb
can still
typically.
support it.
Yes, typically it's half of the thickness of the web of the runway beam is like a rule of thumb typically, and that's something that again we would refer to our structural engineer. But yes, that there have been occasions where I've had a contractor not supply to the 3/8 inch tolerance on his runway beams because his building was so far out, and we've gotten the engineers involved to help come up with a solution, whether or not, what that solution is, web stiffeners or what that is. But it does happen occasionally. It sounds like on your project, some foresight as far as from some of the manufacturers for slotting the holes could have been helpful for you there. But yeah, when it gets that far out, we get the engineers involved to help come up with a design solution.
I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I think this is a question. Seth Collins writes, the web tolerance is in the CMAA, correct? Maybe Seth unmute, maybe kind of further explain what you're after there.
Yeah, that the tolerance, what he just said was rule of thumb. That's actually published, isn't it, in the CMAA, or am I wrong?
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know, and I don't have the CMAA right here in front of me. There's a good chance that yes, I'm using that as a rule of thumb for myself because that's just what's in my mind from my memory. But
We'll have to look that up.
But the web of a runway beam is it's not very thick typically. So it's not going to get you much past 3/8 of an inch. I mean, for it to have a web be 3/4 of an inch thick, you'd be looking at a 30 at well over 100 pounds per foot beam. So, but that is, a lot of beams are bigger than that. But on your typical 5, 10, 20 ton crane project, you're not looking at a web thickness that's going to save you anything to get outside of that. The tolerances from the Metal Building Manufacturers Association, their recommendations.
Well, those are the CMAA tolerances from the CMAA book. They just copied and pasted it in here.
Okay, great, thanks.
The thing on the sheet that we're looking at.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on that? Okay, we'll move along to common pitfalls in supplying an overhead crane system.
Common pitfalls. Well, we're talking about when we show up to install, erect an overhead crane system, these are some of the things we run into. A lot of times the garage doors, not a lot of times, sometimes the garage doors can be in the way. There's radiant heaters overhead. Runway beams not installed to specification. So the straightness, we talked a whole bunch about that. Justin mentioned that the first thing we do when we go to set our rail is to shoot lines and measure those tolerances to make sure that they're right. Like water pipes in the way, end stops not being there. We touched on that. Tiebacks not being installed, so the runway system isn't completely installed when we show up. There's quite a few things. And what type of things have you guys run into in the past? Any comments there?
And my big thing I'd like to add to this is I talked with our other project manager about these common pitfalls, and his first comment to me was lack of communication between the crane supplier and the general contractor and the crane supplier, and then the general contractor and his subcontractors. You have approved final crane drawings, and I think that you should be, at a minimum, emailing those to individual subs, but also printing them out and giving them for like your garage door sub in the field. I don't think having them just on Procore or whatever online form you're using, to let them know, here's the crane, that's what's going to be up there, and you need to work around that. I think that's real important. So just keeping the lines of communication open between yourself and your crane supplier, and then using that approved crane drawing to supply that to all the different subs to let them know, because garage doors are in the way. And, I just had, water pipes in the way not that long ago. And, if they would have had drawings when they, for their field crew installing these things, that probably would not have happened.
Correct.
So back to Wally asking if anybody has, done a project in the past, what's something that somebody else has seen, we can talk about it.
I'm going to just interject, and anybody wants to wave their hand up or shoot a chat question, please do. Going back to, you had mentioned about end stops and who those should be coming from. My personal belief on the end stops, I always feel like the line of demarcation between the metal building provider and the steel package that they are providing on the scope of work, or in the scope of work, it does seem to be divided up very neatly, when we will provide, obviously, the crane brackets, or if it's an auxiliary column requirement, because it's such a heavy crane, those beams that sit on top of those brackets, auxiliary columns, what have you, and then we're done. We're not gonna then get into the rail business. We can provide the rail as a metal building manufacturer, but I always look at it just from a practical standpoint. We give you the beam, Mr. Contractor, and then the rail is then provided along with the crane system itself, and that end stop that sits on top of that rail then is going to be provided by the crane system provider. And again, it's just it just seems like that tidies things up in terms of who's playing what role in terms of material supply. Where do you draw that line? And again, oftentimes we'll sit there and provide the beams, somebody else provides the rails, or the crane manufacturer would, and then for us to re-interject ourselves and say, oh yeah, we have those crane stops. That's just a personal preference on my end, so that's just something to consider. But I think that the last thing I would add in terms of common pitfalls is oftentimes the crane provider is not giving us the correct span, and they just don't know. The customer doesn't know what the span needs to be, and this is at the pre-con portion of the project. But we always have to have that kind of negotiation. Now, look, are we making the building to fit the crane span, or is the crane span going to be reduced or extended to fit the building envelope? And so those are the really the kind of the two other hot button issues besides obviously the cranes running in the same bay at the same time.
Yeah. So I think the end stops vary between building manufacturers too, Larry. So, Chief likes it that way. That's great. That's why we carry the end stops with us. It makes it simple. Makes it simple.
Tom Carney, he's got another question here. The EOR, engineer of record, is specifying the crane loading, rail method of attachment, tieback method, Gantrix tiebacks, question mark. But the method of support, brackets, separate crane columns, stepped crane columns is dictated by the building manufacturer typically. I would agree with that. And that's a great point about the tiebacks, the Gantrix tiebacks. There's oftentimes where those seem to, when you do a comparison from one scope to the next, those aren't always being offered up. So absolutely something to clarify.
All right, back to the question about the span. Usually when what happens is the guy wants an 80-foot bay and we end up supplying a drawing for an 80-foot bay, so the span might not be 80 foot, it's 75 foot. Usually the manufacturer says what the span of the bay is going to be.
Yeah, there's absolutely a dance there between, the crane manufacturer and the building manufacturer to fit that crane system inside there. And a lot of that has to be worked out even at a preliminary design level. So yeah, again, I guess communication is key here.
Yeah, I'll jump back in and just to, kind of wrap up these pitfalls and say that it's my belief that communication with your crane supplier and then supplying the approved and final crane drawing to your subs, and even going so far as, if you have a job site trailer and other drawings printed and up on the wall inside your trailer, your crane drawing is printed and up on the wall, so you can point right to your subs and say, that's going to be here. It's not here yet, but that's going to be here. And you can't get anything in the way of that crane. I just trying to communicate to the subs, whether or not it's a radiant heater, overhead doors, letting them know. All right, we're going to move on to the next slide, which I think gets us to
Hey,
pretty much
Justin.
the end. Yeah.
Justin, real quick, looks like Tori Clausen, he's got his hand up. Tori, why don't you come off mute and give us what you got?
Yeah, I've got a question on the tiebacks for the crane runway beams. We're on a project that the crane will span 111 feet. It's approximately 70 feet in the air, and each runway beam is right around 45 feet. And my question is the runway beams that they're sitting on, how often would a building manufacturer recommend that be tied back?
To the columns.
Just to the
Yeah.
columns.
Just
So
to the columns.
between the run, it wouldn't need anything.
No, it wouldn't need anything, but the engineer designs it that way. Okay, it still needs to be good and straight, but you just tie it back at the columns.
I would say it would be on your drawings. The engineer that
No,
designed the buildings would be on those drawings.
It is. We're seeing kind of a bowing effect, but I still think it stays within the 3/8 tolerances. And I would assume that the crane, as it's running up and down it, it might, it's going to put it where it wants to go. But I just thought that was kind of a long span, 45 feet. The runway beams are massive, so it works. I just, on other times, I've just seen it tied back more often.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. That's a good point to bring up. We're doing projects. We have one coming up where it's 50-foot spacing and it's going to be an 80-ton runway. And, you have to keep, when you're fabricating, whoever you're getting those runway beams from, they have to be
Good and straight.
good straight beams, and they should be checking that. So, yeah. that would be something
Thank
to
you.
keep in mind when you're erecting runway beams. Talk with your erector about. I mean, I wouldn't be shy to reject a beam if it was not straight
Yeah,
before I put it in the
sure.
air.
For sure. Thank you.
So, we're getting close to wrapping it up. We can do more questions and answers. But I just wanted to kind of say that, if you don't have a good crane supplier, there's plenty of good crane suppliers out there. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have in the future. Feel free to contact us. Just having good open communication and somebody that answers their phone when you call and can work together with you and your engineer, your pre-engineered metal building supplier. That's a good thing to have. So I think we just have a slide here with I threw a few pictures in because people always like to see pictures. And then the last slide is just a question and answer slide. But I think that puts us up to we're into 40 minutes and we were thinking this was going to be about 30 to 45 minutes. So Larry, if you want to see if there's any other questions that anyone wants to answer, and then we'll just kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, well, number one, thank you for taking the time and putting this together. I intend to send out a email to everybody that was on this call, or at least had requested to be in this meeting. So I did get some chatter off to the side that there were some issues joining the meeting. I'm not really sure why. There was upwards of 52, I think, at one point. So, but I will send out a link to download the actual presentation that we're on right now, so people can circulate that as needed. And then I will absolutely then make sure that your contact information is included in that, Justin, so that you guys could be a resource for our network here today.
Yeah, great. And I'll get you that PDF with this crane inquiry data sheet and some of these the CMAA classes. So that everybody has at least that crane inquiry data sheet that I highlighted some of the most important questions I think to ask the end user at the beginning of the project. But we appreciate everybody taking the time to spend some of their lunchtime with us. And I know it's short, but I think, a good wrap up is, have a good crane supplier, good metal building supplier. Keep those lines of communication open between your crane supplier and your metal building supplier. It's good practice.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Let's all have a good weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.